Welcome, everyone, to our October 2025 Abbeville Institute Conference on the 14th Amendment. We're very happy to have you here. And I think that this topic is both timely and, of course, important as we're looking at all the major issues that we're confronting in the United States today, whether it's immigration, which we're going to talk about, incorporation, which is a big deal. And, of course, we'll get into that more as we go through the various presentations. Just to remind you, if you haven't gotten your name tag yet, please do it. Also, pick up your notebook and your schedule. We do start at 9 o'clock tomorrow. If you're staying at the hotel, you, of course, get breakfast on free of charge through the hotel. And, of course, tomorrow we do have lunch and dinner here as well. So we're looking forward to a good conference. We have a lot of great speakers, and I'm excited to have you all here. Of course, the 14th Amendment, and the topic of my presentation is a 14th Amendment mindset. And I'm going to hit some highlights as to what we're going to talk about in the conference. I don't want to steal anyone's thunder that's going to present tomorrow. I want them to be able to explore these topics in more detail. But my job is to put some things in your mind about what we're going to do. And I'm going to start with a very long quote, and I'm going to have a bunch of these, that has to do with some of the things we're going to think about with the 14th Amendment. Now, when I say a 14th Amendment mindset, Americans live in that world, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But almost everything we think about in modern politics is framed by the 14th Amendment. And this particular quote is from 1823. Now, of course, that's before the 14th Amendment was proposed, passed, and ratified. But it's a quote from Bushrod Washington. Of course, Bushrod Washington is related to George Washington. He's the son of George Washington's brother, and he was a Supreme Court justice. And when he was riding the circuit in 1823, he made a decision in this particular case of Corfield v. Coryell, where he talked about the privileges and immunities clause of the Constitution. And if you go through the 14th Amendment, and I'm going to play a little clip from a constitutionalist scholar, this is one of the keys to the argument that the 14th Amendment is really the current Constitution of the United States. And so when you think about privileges and immunities, what does that mean? And Americans have a concept of that, and they don't even realize it, but they think that they have certain privileges, things that they can do, rights, whatever term you want to use, because they live in the United States or in the state where they reside. And so Bushrod Washington said this: "The right of a citizen of one state to pass through or to reside in any other state for purposes of trade, agriculture, professional pursuits, or otherwise, to claim the benefit of the writ of habeas corpus, to institute and maintain actions of any kind in the courts of the state, to take, hold, or dispose of property, either real or personal, and an exemption from higher taxes or impositions than are paid by the other citizens of the state, may be mentioned as some of the particular privileges and immunities of citizens, which are clearly embraced by the general description of privileges deemed to be fundamental." So, we have the Privileges and Immunities Clause in the Constitution. This is before the 14th Amendment. Now, Bushrod Washington was simply opining. This is just his opinion on these things. It didn't mean that he was right. And generally what happens when you start talking about interpretation of the Constitution or, particular parts of the Constitution, people will go out and they'll find a judge that agrees with them or, some decision that agrees with them. They cherry pick things. And Bushrod Washington, of course, is part of that. Now, he is going to be, I'm sure that our other presenters are going to mention Bushrod Washington once or twice, because he is, again, a key to understanding how the left in particular wants to interpret the 14th Amendment. Now, he says that's a privilege and immunity. So also, to which may be added, the elective franchise, as regulated and established by the laws or constitution of the state in which it is to be exercised. Now, that would have been news to anybody in the founding generation that thought somehow the Privileges and Immunities Clause allowed people, or at least dictated the franchise, who could vote and who could not vote. Well, that didn't factor into the various state constitutions or how people thought about elections before this point. But here's Bushrod Washington saying, well, this is what privilege and immunity is. And again, keep that in mind, because that will be discussed with the 14th Amendment. These and many others which might be mentioned are, strictly speaking, privileges and immunities, and the enjoyment of them by the citizens of each state and every other state was manifestly calculated, to use the expressions of the preamble of the corresponding provision in the old Articles of Confederation, the better to secure and perpetuate mutual friendship and intercourse among the people of the different states of the Union. So there, notice he mentions the Articles of Confederation. That's also a key with privileges and immunities because that clause is in the Articles. So did it carry the same meaning, or is Bushrod Washington expanding on that here in 1823? But this was little noticed because this was a circuit court decision. Nobody paid much attention to it until later when we started talking about the 14th Amendment. Now, that's 1823. I want to fast forward about 25 years to William H. Seward. Now, why would I bring up William H. Seward? Well, eventually Seward is Secretary of State in the Lincoln administration, but at this point he's a senator from New York, U.S. Senator from New York. And he makes a speech in 1850 during the Compromise of 1850 debates that's known as the Higher Law Speech. And the reason I'm using this is because essentially, as you're going to see from quotes, various scholars on the 14th Amendment, that is their argument. The 14th Amendment creates what's called a moral constitution. A moral constitution. And in 1850, Seward was standing in the U.S. Senate, and he's making this higher law speech, which of course was controversial even then. Southerners didn't really know what to think about this thing. If there's a higher law than the Constitution, then what are we doing? How can there be a higher law than the Constitution when you're thinking of the structure of government or the powers of government? That's really impossible. But Seward said, but there is a higher law than the Constitution, which regulates our authority over the domain and devotes it to the same noble purposes. The territory is part, no inconsiderable part, of the common heritage of mankind, bestowed upon them by the Creator of the universe. We are his stewards and must so discharge our trust as to secure in the highest attainable degree their happiness. So he's talking about the Western territories here, of course, California. But by simply saying there's a higher law than the Constitution, that's going to factor into how people think about the 14th Amendment. Is there a current higher law than the U.S. Constitution? Well, yes, it's the 14th Amendment to many people. That's it. And so that kind of spirit is going to carry forward into the 1860s. The Republican Party, of course, becomes the party of this higher law doctrine. There are certain individuals who are firmly behind it. There are, of course, some more moderate Republicans who don't necessarily believe this, but for the most part, this is going to be the driving force of the Republican Party when it comes to the Constitution, as we'll look at when we talk about the history of the 14th Amendment, who was behind it. I know we're going to talk a lot about Bingham and others, Jacob Howard. We're going to look at some of these people in some of these talks, I'm sure. And they were firmly behind this view of the Constitution. But so were other people, like Thomas Nast. Now, this is a really interesting image. The title of this is The Uprising of the North. And it's when this was in a presentation. Think of a motion picture in the 1860s. You would have these big rolls of canvas, and they would paint these, and they would be panels, and they would scroll across the stage, and they would play music while they were doing this. It's like going to a movie. Well, Thomas Nast, who was a German, arrived in the United States. He wasn't part of the 48ers. He was kind of on the back end of that, but he was a young man. But during the war, of course, he became an ardent supporter of the Union cause. He was a very famous cartoonist. In fact, it's the image of Santa Claus we have today comes from Thomas Nast. And that came from an image he made of a Union camp where Santa Claus was visiting the Union soldiers, and he had a little puppet of Jefferson Davis, and he was giving out presents to the Unions. Santa Claus was a Unionist, right? He's not one of these evil Southerners. But when they showed this image in this panorama, there were several other images in this group, the battle cry of freedom was played in the background, right? And so if you look at the painting, what do you see? What's going on here? Yeah, you've got that image in the background. Let's focus on the foreground first. What do you notice about the Union soldiers? They're knights. They're not soldiers, they're knights. Right? And you have, what else do you see? You have Columbia on the balcony. with the knights going off to go and crusade against the South, right? This is the higher law in an image, because they're doing this. Of course, you might talk about the city upon the hill. That's Washington, D.C. in the background. I mean, this is what they're doing. They're doing it for the glory of the city of Washington and, of course, the government, and they're going to go fight all the heathens. If you put this in the terms of the crusade, and you had people that were interested, I mean, most Northerners at this time were Christians. It's not like today where half the population doesn't even have any religion, and half the population does. I mean, here, most Americans were Christians at this time, and so they understood this image of the crusade. Well, Southerners in this image are reduced to non-Christians. These are the Muslims that we have to go and crusade against and conquer and destroy because of the higher law, right? So it's that righteous cause in so many ways in an image or the higher law that will become the 14th Amendment. So let me talk about that mindset. The 14th Amendment has become the Constitution of the United States. Now, not in structure, right? We still have 3 branches of government in the federal government. We still have the states as part of this. We still have the separation of powers, and Congress does things, and the president does things, and the judiciary does things. But in terms of the way people think about the Constitution, this is what they're, in their mind, if you were to do a man on the street, this is what they would come up with, the 14th Amendment. In fact, every major question that we have in America today is kind of wrapped into the 14th Amendment. So you think about it. If you were to go to out here in Georgia or Alabama and you started talking about gun control, well, what are people going to say about gun control in this part of the United States? Well, I have a Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. Well, they're only saying that because of the 14th Amendment, because the 14th Amendment incorporated the Second Amendment, right? What that means is it applies to the states as well. That's a 14th Amendment question, and we've seen that argued by the Supreme Court. In fact, I just saw today that the Trump administration is going after Hawaii now and trying to knock down their gun control regulations based on a 14th Amendment understanding of the Constitution. Now, we might applaud that and say, yeah, we want people in Hawaii to be able to carry firearms as they wish. But in reality, what Trump has done and what the Department of Justice is doing in this is going along with the leftist interpretation of the 14th Amendment and the U.S. Constitution. If we were to go to Colorado or California and say, hey, what about this abortion issue? They would start talking about abortion from a 14th Amendment position. Well, this is my right to privacy. This is a Fourth Amendment issue, whatever it is. They would come up with some defense of it. Of course, we know that after the Supreme Court returned this back to the states, they woke up in California and nothing had changed because, well, that really is a state issue. But at the end of the day, they're going to speak of these things like a 14th Amendment issue. Well, it's all about the 14th Amendment. I have a constitutional right to X, Y, or Z. We can talk about police powers. We can talk about a host of culture war issues that are all wrapped up into this 14th Amendment. So when I say that Americans have a 14th Amendment mindset, that's what I mean. Everything they do, if they say, well, let's say you get a traffic ticket and you're driving down the road, there's a camera here that captures your license plate. One of the first things people want to do is say, well, I should actually sue because that's infringing on my Fourth Amendment right to privacy. Well, that's not really a 14th. It's not a Fourth Amendment issue. You're in the city of Columbus, Georgia. It might be a state issue. Maybe there's a violation of the state constitution, but they're going to think of this as a U.S. Constitution issue because they have a 14th Amendment mindset. That's the point. So that's one thing we have to try to break. And we're going to have a discussion about, can conservatives, people on the right, work within this mindset? That's going to be one of the talks tomorrow. I'm really interested in seeing how that works. But can you go along with a 14th Amendment mindset and use it against the other side? And there is an answer of yes, there's an affirmative of that. But on the other hand, we need to be trying to tear some of this stuff down because it does work more against conservatives than it does for them, typically. Now, we also have this new concept of something called 14th Amendment originalism. This is really interesting. So for years, we've had people on the right call themselves originalists. What that means is that you believe the U.S. Constitution should be interpreted through the original public meaning of the document. How did the people that ratified it, or what did they say about it when they ratified it, and what it means, right? So we're talking about the Federalists most conspicuously, but all the other papers that were written, people like John Dickinson writing in favor of the Constitution, or Roger Sherman or others, and then of course you have the other side of that, the so-called anti-Federalists. What did they say about the document? And the response to that is typically what we get in this conversation about what the Constitution means. Well, that's now been applied to the 14th Amendment, most notably by a conservative scholar named Randy Barnett. And I'll talk about him in a minute because that is the greatest challenge in many ways, his book that he produced just a couple of years ago, to the anti-14th Amendment crowd. I think that it's something that everyone has to deal with. But it is a lasting impact of the war. So a 14th Amendment originalist will say, yeah, I'm an originalist too. I believe that we should interpret the 14th Amendment the way that it was ratified. And the way it was ratified is the righteous cause position. Those people really wanted incorporation. They wanted this kind of moral higher law constitution. That's the original interpretation of the 14th Amendment. And how do we know this? Well, it's exciting. Well, because of this we can look at the public debates, what we have fragmentary, but Barnett's going to use the unwritten Constitution to defend his position in many ways. Whether it's the ruminations of a Supreme Court justice in 1871 talking about, well, I think that what privileges and immunities means is what Bushrod Washington said it meant. Or at some other, state court judge somewhere. This is what he dusts off to try to come up with this stuff. But we have all of this case law. It's the unwritten Constitution next to the written Constitution. So we have to deal with that too, as we're talking about what these things mean. We have a written Constitution, but we have this whole other Constitution that operates because of case law. If you're not a lawyer or a judge, that gets rather confusing at times. And that's also one of the big fundamental problems in American politics, right? A lot of people talk about the written Constitution, but then we have this other thing out there that complicates things because we have an unwritten Constitution too, and we have to reconcile those things at times. Now, we also have this idea of a race-conscious Constitution. That comes out of the 14th Amendment. So we're talking about DEI and all these issues of race. The newest Supreme Court justice, Ketanji Brown Jackson, calls herself a 14th Amendment originalist, and she says that the Constitution or the 14th Amendment in particular, is a race-conscious Constitution. So it is about race, and so when we talk about issues of race, that's actually baked into the 14th Amendment. So these issues are part of our discussion about things. We like to talk about a colorblind constitution or a constitution that doesn't mention race, but she says that's not true when you talk about the 14th Amendment. And I'm going to play a clip from another scholar that does the exact same thing. And of course, compared to that is the compromise constitution, the original Constitution, which people would argue is not a race-based constitution. This is what the scholar Noah Feldman called the broken Constitution. That one broke. And we got this new one, this new moral constitution that was created by the war. This is where you get the usefulness of the abolitionist constitution and the righteous cause. One thing this will do for Americans today, if we think about politics, it frees Americans from guilt. How many times have you seen the Republican Party, and this was the 1776 Commission report, they champion the old discarded heroes of the left because that frees them from the guilt, from the stain of slavery and racism. If they don't have to talk about those things, we can just move on. The problem for them is that the left will talk about those things, and they're going to say that these people are bad anyways. And so when you try to pick up their talking points, you're playing on their field by their rules, and typically they're going to win. So this is part of the issue of the 14th Amendment. It's why if they can focus on the 14th and make it the Constitution, they know they've rigged the game in their favor. And then this is where I'm going to get to Barnett in a minute, and how that's why his book is so difficult. Now, what we have to do is break this 14th Amendment mindset. The question is, how are we going to do that? We're going to talk about, can it be used against the left? This is then a very substantial uphill battle. Clarence Thomas has intimated that he is interested in trying to roll back incorporation, but that's going to be an interesting process. They already did it with the case with the abortion situation, but are they going to do it in other areas? Of course, we're talking about same-sex marriage and other things that there are some discussions about rolling back. I don't know how this is going to work long-term, but there is at least some conversation about this. And that is, again, part of this culture war. Now, let me go to this next slide. This is Akil Reed Amar. He is one of the more prominent, popular constitutional scholars in the United States. And I say popular because he's written all kinds of books, and you can go to the Barnes & Noble and you're going to find Amar's books on the bookshelf. I mean, that's how popular he is. And, of course, because of that, you have to also wrestle with Amar. Now, what he is going to describe here in 2 minutes is the 14th Amendment mindset. So I just want to play this for you. This is really quite interesting.
We're all born citizens, and we're all born equal citizens. We're all created equal. There's an implicit equality idea there because if we're all citizens and we have the same status. So it's a codification of Lincoln's reinterpretation of Jefferson. It doesn't say race. The 15th Amendment's going to say race, color, or previous condition of servitude. It could have said race. We're born equal. It is about racial equality, whether we're born black or white. But we're also born equal whether we're born male or female, Jew or Gentile. Second sentence, states have to follow fundamental rights. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. At its core, that's going to be, if you just think about what are your privileges and immunities as a citizen? Well, stuff in the Bill of Rights: speech, press, petition, assembly, free exercise of religion, right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures, and other fundamental stuff too. Privacy. So where do we find these fundamental rights? There's actually reference
That's Eric
to
Foner,
rights
by the way.
of persons as alongside citizens, because due process is a privilege or immunity. So why do they say due process again a second time? Because they believe, Mr. Trump, that persons, even who weren't citizens, had constitutional rights. Dred Scott said, no one who's black can be a citizen. They said, yes, you can be a citizen. That's the first sentence. And Dred Scott also said, only citizens have constitutional rights. They said, no, people who aren't citizens also have constitutional rights to due process. Okay. But it wasn't quite about voting rights, political rights. Section 2 indirectly protects voting rights in a certain way. It talks, for the first time, the words the right to vote appear in the Constitution, but Section 2 doesn't directly guarantee that. It just says if certain folks are disfranchised, the state gets fewer seats in the House of Representatives and the Electoral College. It's an indirect way of incentivizing a right to vote.
Okay. Now, isn't that wonderful? Right? So the other person, that's Amar, and then they cut away. That was Eric Foner, who we're going to talk about in a minute, because Eric Foner is also a driving force behind this stuff. In fact, his latest book is cited all over the place now when it comes to the 14th Amendment. But notice what he did there. He talks about the Bill of Rights as being part of your privileges and immunities. He talks about citizenship. We're going to get into that. We're going to talk about immigration and what that means with the 14th Amendment. These are all wrapped into this 14th Amendment Constitution. Everything we think about as major issues in America can come back to the 14th Amendment. It's why it's so important. And look, people like Amar and people like Foner and people like Jack, take your pick, they control the game. And so this is a very hard path to go down because you have to undo this mindset. Let's see. Okay. Now, I want to go back to 1801 because there was a Supreme Court justice from Alabama named Hugo Black. And Hugo Black, in the middle of the 20th century, essentially gave us the modern incorporation doctrine. And he did it through Thomas Jefferson. and a very strange reading of Thomas Jefferson, but that's what he did. So I want to go back to 1801 and talk about the very famous exchange between Jefferson and the Danbury Baptists. The Danbury Baptists are in Connecticut, and they're concerned in 1801. Why? Well, because Connecticut has a state-established church, and it's not a Baptist church. And the state-established church in Connecticut is infringing on their freedom of religion. Well, does that sound odd? This is 1801. When were the Bill of Rights ratified? 1791. This is 10 years later. And the Danbury Baptists are saying, we don't have any freedom of religion in Connecticut. Well, why? Because the First Amendment didn't apply to Connecticut, and everybody knew it. So they write to Thomas Jefferson. He'd been elected president. He's now president of the United States, and they want to congratulate him, but also bring up a point. They say, sir, we are sensible that the President of the United States is not the national legislator. Wow, that's remarkable. And also sensible that the national government cannot destroy the laws of each state. Oh my gosh. These guys sound pretty good. But our hopes are strong that the sentiments of our beloved president, which have had such genial effect already, like the radiant beams of the sun, will shine and prevail through all these states and all the world till hierarchy and tyranny be destroyed from the earth. So we're hoping that you, the sun president, will destroy everything in the earth, all these bad things. Sir, when we reflect on your past services and see a glow of philanthropy and goodwill shining forth in a course of more than 30 years, we have reason to believe that America's God has raised you up to fill the chair of state out of that goodwill which he bears to the millions which you preside over. May God strengthen you for the arduous task which Providence and the voice of the people have called you to sustain and support you in your administration against all the predetermined opposition of those who wish to rise to wealth and importance on the poverty and subjection of the people. So that's a nice way of, praising Thomas Jefferson. But the first two lines are important. This is what everybody misses in the letters of the Danbury Baptist. They don't read this part because Jefferson responds in kind. He's responding to their point that we know you can't do anything about this, but we hope one day, like the sun, the beams of Jeffersonianism will wipe out all this tyranny and oppression in America. So Jefferson responds. And this is 1802. He writes it in 1801. It goes to the Danbury Baptist in 1802. He says, quote, believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legitimate powers of government reach actions only and not opinions, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now notice, I put there in, that's my emphasis, but their legislature. Who is he talking about there? The Congress, the U.S. Congress, not the state of Connecticut. He's saying, well, this is good. We have an amendment to the Constitution that prohibits the U.S. Congress from doing this stuff. But he's not saying anything about Connecticut. They can do whatever they want. Thus, building a wall of separation between church and state. That's the line that's pulled. But he's not talking about the states as Connecticut or Virginia. He's talking about Congress. Everyone takes that out of context, including Hugo Black. Congress, thus inhibited from acts respecting their religion and the executive authorized only to execute their acts, I have refrained from prescribing even occasional performances of devotion prescribed, indeed, legally where an executive is the legal head of a national church, but subject here as religious exercises only to the voluntary regulations and disciplines of each respective sect. Now, I added the emphasis there because he cut that out of the letter. But he basically explains there, I don't have any power to do anything what you're asking me to do. I can't do that. I don't even give you, these declarations of, proclamations of prayer or thanksgiving. I don't do that either. I don't think I should. But Connecticut's on your own, right? And in fact, what the Danbury Baptists were trying to get Jefferson to do essentially was do this very thing, issue some type of proclamation that would, have a day of thanksgiving or prayer. Adhering to this expression of the supreme will of the nation in behalf of the rights of conscience, I shall see with sincere satisfaction the progress of those sentiments which tend to restore to man all his natural rights conceived. He has no natural right in opposition to his social duties. So, he's hoping that one day Connecticut will get on board with this idea of freedom of religion, but he has no power to do it. That's the original Constitution. Now, again, Hugo Black's going to take this out of context, and he's going to say, the 14th Amendment thing, well, we can use that to apply that to the states because we've got this 14th Amendment. You see? We all know that the Bill of Rights didn't apply, even though we've got Bushrod Washington out there saying it does somehow, and you've got members of Congress in the 39th Congress saying that somehow the Bill of Rights applies to the states through the Supremacy Clause, which is absolute insanity. Nobody ever thought of that before. In fact, they were called out for it. Well, the Bill of Rights applies to the states because of the Supremacy Clause. And another congressman stood up, senator, said, no, it doesn't. Nobody's ever said that before. You're making that up. Now, let's fast forward to 2022 and Justice Jackson. After Justice Jackson had issued a dissent and in one of the major rulings on race from the Supreme Court, there was a lot of talk about what's called 14th Amendment or progressive originalism. And this is from the Columbia Undergraduate Law Review in 2022. It's a quote. This was an anonymous piece in that publication. But it said, Justice Jackson's progressive originalist arguments offer liberals in the country a new perspective on analyzing race consciousness in the Constitution. Her use of a progressive originalist framework counters the commonly understood form of originalism employed by those like former Justice Scalia and Justice Thomas. By reading the Constitution in a race-conscious manner, the ideologically liberal justices could argue that voting rights for minority groups should be protected as intended by the architects of the 14th Amendment. You see, this is 14th Amendment originalism or progressive originalism. So what the Columbia Undergraduate Law Review is saying, hey, look, you three liberal justices, you need to go and do this because it's going to set case law. We're going to start having this in the dissents. We're going to start seeing this, and people can dust that off and use it to their advantage later on. Even if we don't have the majority on the court now, we'll eventually get it. It's probably true. Eventually the left will take back over the court at some point, and we'll be able to use that to go after the other side again. So keep doing it, because this is a new way to use the 14th Amendment to advance our political agenda. One of my favorite, not because he's right, but because at least he's interesting, columnist at the New York Times, Jamel Bowie, talks about this a little bit. He says, look, what we need to have, now this was when Biden was in office. He's kind of changed his tune a little bit because, well, Biden's not in office anymore. But what we need to do is prohibit the Supreme Court from declaring any federal law unconstitutional. Everything Congress does needs to go through. Just put it right through. But the states, now we need to declare all of that unconstitutional. We can go after that stuff all day, because that's where the real opposition is to the progressive agenda. And you think even in states like California, they've resisted this stuff. So if we could just let the Congress do whatever they want and then knock down the states, that would work. And if you follow a 14th Amendment or progressive originalist interpretation, that works just fine, because, of course, incorporation would allow you to do that. Here's Noah Feldman. Wrote a book entitled The Broken Constitution. We had this Constitution that was a compromise constitution, he called it. That Constitution was broken by Lincoln. One of the things I will give Noah Feldman credit for, he admits that Lincoln was doing many unconstitutional things as president. He admits it. That essentially strict construction was the proper way to interpret the Constitution until the war. And then Lincoln broke the Constitution and he created a new Constitution, you see, and that's the new Constitution that we have. So he's basically said, hey, Abbeville Institute, y'all have been right all these years, you see. But he thinks that's a good thing that Lincoln broke it, rather than our perspective that Lincoln broke it, and that's a bad thing. So he said it took Lincoln well over a year of his presidency, a period in which secession had occurred and the war raged, to acknowledge the reality that the old constitutional compromise could never be restored. When he eventually did, the Emancipation Proclamation was the result. Now, he focuses entirely on slavery. That's what he says the point of the, I mean, he argues essentially the original Constitution was by default, kind of the Garrisonian model. It was a pro-slavery Constitution. But then I emphasize this next sentence. The rupture of the Constitution opened the door for its reconstruction on new terms as the moral Constitution we know and revere today. The higher law. It's the moral Constitution. It's no longer just a structure of government. It's no longer about separation of powers and federalism. No, no, no. This is about a new moral imperative coming from the central government. The transformation took 3 constitutional amendments, including the 14th. They abolished slavery, guaranteed equal protection of the laws for all citizens, and extended voting rights to African American men. Over the next 150 years, those amendments were by turns applied during Reconstruction, betrayed through the rise of Jim Crow segregation, and redeemed by Brown v. Board of Education. One of the things when you go to law school, and I've not gone, but I know I have lawyers in here, and I've talked to a lot of lawyers. One of the things you have to do when you go to your con law class in law school is try to figure out how Brown v. Board of Education was constitutional. I mean, because if you look at the original Constitution, it's you got to do some mental gymnastics to come to that conclusion. But if you can do it, well, then you're in, right? You're in the club. The Civil Rights Movement, the landmark laws enacted as a result of the movement's influence, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, all of these things were part of this new moral constitution. Today, more than ever, we realize that the redemption of it was itself incomplete. We remain, however, committed to the idea the moral constitution embodied in those amendments should be our beacon. Lincoln's transformed moral version of the Constitution endures. I mean, you just want to have hosannas singing in the background, like angels appear, because, the Lincoln's moral constitution endures. And here we have Eric Foner. I've only got, one slide left after this. But Eric Foner. Now, Eric Foner wrote a book entitled The Second Founding. The Second Founding has been cited now quite a bit in academic journals, whether it's legal journals or historical journals, as being, or even books, as being this new interpretation of Reconstruction. It's not new, really, because people have talked about this stuff for years. I mean, even during the war, James Bayard of Delaware essentially said that the North was undergoing a French Revolution. It was something entirely different. That was radical. He recognized it. People understood this. But I think what generally happened after the war, when you had the compromise period, when Southerners were brought back in the Union, and we have this discussion of what the United States is going to be, the North tried to downplay that a lot because they needed the South, right? They needed Southerners to win wars. We had to go and fight the Spanish. Then we had to fight the Germans and the Japanese and everybody else. And Southerners had to be a part of that. And we had to have this great reunited America. And we shook hands, and Southerners would say Abraham Lincoln's great, and Northerners would say, yeah, you rebels out there, you guys were okay. You fought hard, you lost, but that's okay. We respect you. That's all gone. Particularly with this new 14th Amendment originalism. That's gone. We're seeing it on an everyday basis, right? Monuments have to come down. We have to change how we think about the South. Even conservatives, quote unquote, are doing that, which is what I'm going to talk about in the next slide. So Eric Foner, of course, is a communist. People will deny that, but he is. His family were all communists. Eric Foner, if you don't know who he is, he rose to fame by writing a book on Reconstruction where essentially all he did was take W.E.B. Du Bois and regurgitate him. That was it. Well, W.E.B. Du Bois was right about Reconstruction, so we're going to write a whole book about W.E.B. Du Bois and Reconstruction. And he painted his opponents as all being racist, and they don't talk about it. They're all wrong. The Dunning School, it was called. It's all wrong. We can't talk about those people anymore. They had nothing valuable to say because they had the wrong views on race. And by doing that, he knew it. He knew the result because he's using that hammer of emotivism, right? These people are bad because they hold views that aren't in accordance with the modern era in terms of race. And so he knew that people would start disregarding Dunning. And I have a personal example. When I was in graduate school, I had a student at South Carolina ask me one time, what is your favorite book on Reconstruction? I said, I kind of like E. Merton Coulter's book on Reconstruction. Oh, that's a good older view. But, I tend to like, Eric Foner. But that's the thing. It's the older view. You can't read the older stuff because that's bad because of these people don't agree with him on terms of social issues today. Okay, I mean, if we're going to do that, then we have to get rid of all kinds of stuff in history we can't read anymore. But Eric Foner, is the darling of the American historical profession, including when it comes to Reconstruction. Another professor at South Carolina, not Clyde Wilson, but another, and I'm not going to say who he is to protect the innocent, but he, in a class on a reading seminar, he brought out a chart. And this is a very good, very professional professor. He said, look, here's the problem with American history. Eric Foner. Let me explain why. Before Eric Foner, you could write all kinds of things about Reconstruction, diplomacy, military, economics. You could write lots of stuff. But since Eric Foner took over all the professional journals, it's all narrowed now to race. That's the only thing you can write on. If you write on anything else, you're not going to get published. Unless you include race in that somehow, right? So that was the issue. He changed the direction of how we think about American history single-handedly. This is why when Amar's up there talking, they zoom to Foner because, God is saying this is okay, essentially. Eric Foner has anointed Amar. Yes, you are speaking the truth, Amar. I've anointed you okay. It's embarrassing, but this is what has happened. So this is what Eric Foner said. Over time, the 14th Amendment would lead many Americans to view the federal government as the ultimate protector of their rights, to expand the definition of those rights far beyond anything known before the Civil War or anticipated by the 39th Congress. Now, what has he maybe implicitly said there? Even the 39th Congress didn't know that all this stuff is going to be created after the war was over, like the 14th Amendment originalists claim, that they said all these things were baked in. But we've expanded the rights of Americans beyond anything known before the Civil War. But the rights revolution, I put that in italics, launched by the war and emancipation was not yet complete. The very ambiguity of the language of Section 1 left it uncertain how radical a shift had taken place in the relative powers of the state and federal governments, what specific rights and entitlements were now being guaranteed by national authority. The answers would be worked out over time and would depend on the future balance of political power. But the 14th Amendment gave us a political revolution. It's a legal revolution, but it's also a political revolution because that is the power. You see, the 14th Amendment allows the political side to work. So I want to finish this presentation with a discussion of Randy Barnett. Randy Barnett is a very prominent modern conservative, more libertarian legal scholar. He essentially is characterized as being on the right. Well, he's also an originalist. Openly calls himself that. I am an originalist. I believe in the originalist interpretation of the Constitution. I believe we should go to original public meaning to find what this thing means on various topics. So he and his colleague at Georgetown School of Law, Evan Bernick, wrote a book entitled The Original Meaning of the 14th Amendment. The introduction of this book is written by a man named James Oakes. Now, if you don't know who James Oakes is, he is a historian, a U.S. historian, who is certainly on the left, way on the left. Oakes loves this book. That's because what Barnett is trying to do is come up with a nationalist consensus on American history. So, Americans are angry today on so many social issues because we do not allow for a safety valve. What I mean by that is if the people of Alabama want to have it to where everybody can walk around open carrying all day long if they want to, and that's what the people of Alabama want, why does California get to determine that? Or if California wants to have the most open laws on abortion or anything else, any other social issue you can think of, why should Alabama get to determine what the people of California get to have? It's the Federalist safety valve that what Jefferson talked about with the Danbury Baptists existed. Now, the Danbury Baptists, of course, weren't happy with it, but you know what the Danbury Baptists could have done? They could have moved to Virginia, and then they could have had a Baptist church all day long, and nobody would have said a word to them. They could have moved to New York. They could have just gone over the border into New York, and they would have had their Baptist church all day. But if we nationalize everything, this creates a lot of anger in the United States because we have razor-thin political majorities. We've got 50% plus one, or not even 50%, dictating to the other nearly 50% what we should do about every social issue under the sun. That creates problems. But what Barnett is trying to do is say, you know what? That's okay. If we all just agreed on this fundamental nationalist framework, we just have to get over it. Because the right might like it if we're talking about gun control or civil liberties in some ways, but the left is going to like it when it comes to things like, social issues like same-sex marriage or other issues. They're going to like that part of it. So if we could all just agree this is okay, then we'd all just get along in this stuff, and we'd all leave it to the courts essentially to decide how all this stuff works. Because all these issues would go to the court, or Congress could pass all this legislation they wanted. It's the 14th Amendment says they can do it, and we would all just put all our faith in 535 people in Washington, D.C. that represent now, each person represents about 1 million Americans. That's not representative government, but that's what we should do, according to Randy Barnett. This is what he said. After the Emancipation Proclamation, Republicans were right to think that for slavery to end as a constitutional matter, the Constitution itself needed to be amended to change its original meaning. In the face of terrorist resistance and the perpetuation of white supremacy through state law by recalcitrant Southerners, ignoring the fact that John Bingham actually didn't want the 14th Amendment really to apply to the North because they wanted to have federalism there so they could handle these issues, but the South had to be gotten, right? John Bingham was also right to perceive a want of power in the federal government that needed to be supplied, notwithstanding the 13th Amendment. The moral legitimacy of the Constitution thus required a 14th Amendment. The moral legitimacy of the Constitution. What the 14th Amendment has done, and I think what we're going to see throughout this entire seminar tomorrow, is create this national environment that we all are nervous over. It's why Charlie Kirk is so reviled in Utah when he doesn't even live there. I mean, the person that shot him was from Utah. Charlie Kirk didn't live in Utah. Charlie Kirk shouldn't matter in Utah. But yet, because of this nationalist environment, these people become, whatever, left or right, they become a problem for your state. Instead of letting these things be worked out at the state level, we start working everything out. We start solving this in the court of public opinion at a national level, or through the federal courts, or through 535 members of Congress who really don't have any representative oversight whatsoever anymore. It's not much better in California, where it's, I think, 235,000 to 1 is the representative ratio there. It's awful. Now, New England, much as we pick on New England, I think in New Hampshire, their representative ratio is like 2,000 to 1. It's great. But this is the issue moving forward. And as we talk about issues like immigration or incorporation or liberal justices, we're going to hear that first thing in the morning, or what we can do about, conservatives using the 14th Amendment to their benefit. These are some of the bigger things we have to confront, the 14th Amendment mindset. It's very hard to break, and it's very hard to break because it appeals to so many people in so many different ways. That's the issue. And so you have to get out of that to have any success moving forward and trying to roll back some of this stuff in the culture war in particular, but even in things, we should be talking about the Hawaii issue with the federal government. It's not the right thing to do for the federal government to step in and say to Hawaii, the state of Hawaii can't regulate firearms, unless it's a violation. I mean, the state courts in Hawaii should be able to do this if it violates the Hawaii Constitution. I'm actually going to say Marshall DeRosa at a conference years ago, he was giving a talk, and he said, you know what? In Florida, I'm protected because I have the Florida Constitution that protects my firearms. That's a very federalist thing to say. We should be talking about those issues. And that is the real problem with the 14th Amendment. So, thank you very much for your time tonight. I hope you enjoyed the conference. We got a lot of great talks coming up. So, that's it.